For the first time on film, we're going to take you right behind the scenes and expose what has really gone on in the private investigations mounted by the McCanns. You'll be able to judge for yourselves whether this much trumpeted and expensive private investigation was ever about a wholehearted search for Madeleine, or whether this operation might have had a wholly different purpose. But before we go to the extraordinary details of what the McCanns' private investigators were really doing, how was it all funded? Most of it, from what we have been told, was in fact funded by you, the great British public. Just 13 days after Madeleine was reported missing, and at a time when she could have been found at any time, the McCanns launched a fund, which was officially called Madeleine's Fund, leaving no stone unturned. Let's now take a little look at how and why this fund was set up in the first place. Exactly when it was that the McCanns thought of setting up a fund to find Madeleine is not really certain. In her book Madeleine, Kate McCann explains it like this. On page 120, she says Jerry had set himself the challenge to leave no stone unturned. There were so many people who desperately wanted to help. Jerry's call to arms spurred them into action. Then, she says, Jerry McCann's sister, teacher Philomena McCann, sent a chain mail around the world asking every recipient to help find our little girl, followed by her claim that this led to a first conversation between Philomena and Callum McRae, a former pupil of hers and an IT whiz kid, about establishing a website for Madeleine. 4 pages on in her book, Kate introduces the shadowy group called the International Family Law Group. They appeared to consist of just a barrister who didn't give his name to the McCanns and a paralegal. Later, a third shadowy figure joined them from an organisation called Control Risks Group, who said, "Just call me Hugh." The barrister had apparently offered the McCanns help immediately he heard the news about Madeleine going missing. It was on Friday the 11th of May, barely a week after Madeleine had been reported missing, that these two men of mystery, the barrister and the paralegal, flew out to Praia de Luz. No one knows who paid for this visit, so we are invited by the McCanns to believe that this was the selfless act of a good Samaritan. However, on page 125, Kate McCann does tell us a little more about this third figure. It transpired that he was a former intelligence officer, now a kidnap negotiator and counsellor. She then explains why the Fund for Madeleine was set up. We had discussed the offers of help that were pouring in, including many financial pledges. One of Jerry's colleagues said his staff want to make a donation, but didn't know how or where to deposit it. The IFLG told us we needed to set up a fighting fund. They would devise the objectives of the fund and instruct a leading charity law firm, Bates, Wells and Braithwaite, to draw up articles of association. According to this account then, this Fund for Madeleine was all somebody else's idea and recommendation. And so it was that just days later the organisation Madeleine's Fund, Leaving No Stone Unturned, was founded, and the McCanns began collecting what turned out to be millions of pounds, donated mostly by the ever-willing and generous great British public. In a moment we are going to examine how all that money has been spent, or perhaps, as I'll show, frittered away. It's important to emphasise that Madeleine's Fund is not a charity, although many people think that it is. It is in fact a private company, set up as a trust. And importantly, it is controlled by the McCanns and members of their family. The current directors of Madeleine's Fund are Jerry McCann, Kate McCann, Brian Kennedy, uncle of Kate McCann, Edward Smethurst, the McCanns' coordinating lawyer and a top Freemason, John Corner, close family friend of the McCanns and Madeleine's godfather, and Michael Linnett, family friend and accountant, member of a secretive Catholic Masonic society, the Catenians. What was the original purpose of this fund, though? The honest answer is that it was intended to be a fighting fund to meet legal expenses. In other words, from the get-go it was intended to provide funds for the defence of the McCanns. Just 10 days after Madeleine had been allegedly abducted, and could still have been found alive, why would the McCanns be thinking of needing a legal fighting fund? It was a relative of theirs in the same village, Kate McCann's uncle, Brian Kennedy, who gave the game away in a TV interview in the village.
But I'm joined now by Madeleine's great-uncle, Brian Kennedy, and he's going to tell us about the Fighting Fund. What's been the public's response to it, Brian?
Well, it's been very good so far, but a lot of people have said they're not quite sure how they can give money, so may I tell them?
Yes, very briefly.
Right, very briefly. You can go into any branch of the NatWest or the Royal Bank of Scotland and just say that you would like to make a contribution to the Madeleine Fund.
But tell me, Brian, about all the people that have been coming up to you today, just literally stuffing money in your hand.
Yes, they have. It's very touching, very touching. I would just say this is not an appeal. The family haven't made an appeal. We've just set up a mechanism for people who said they wanted to do something and contribute, so that the money can be used for all sorts of reasons, but probably mainly for legal expenditure.
That was an honest answer. The McCanns already knew or sensed that they would be needing top-line solicitors and barristers. And indeed, over the past 7 years, the McCanns have had legal help worth an estimated £4 million or more. Here's a list. They have spent 5 years trying to claim £1 million damages from Dr. Conchalo Amaral, the coordinator of the initial investigation into Madeleine's disappearance, and attempting to ban his book, The Truth About a Lie. They spent nearly £400,000 silencing retired solicitor Tony Bennett with a libel action after he wrote 2 books on the case. And they've spent a small fortune on legal advice from a series of top solicitors and barristers who have advised them in relation to their having formally been declared suspects in the disappearance of their own daughter and the risks of being extradited to Portugal to face charges. But very soon the message was changed. The fund was not to be used for legal expenses, apparently. Instead, it was to be used to find Madeleine, and they launched a major Look for Madeleine campaign. How much the McCanns have raised in the way of donations and other contributions to their fund is shrouded in mystery. Equally unclear is exactly how all the money has been spent. Although the Madeleine's fund directors have produced annual reports, as required by company law, these are very opaque. Dublin-based accountant Enid O'Dowd has written a major analysis of the fund, titled Madeleine's Fund, Review and Investigation of Accounts. Enid O'Dowd's report shows that the company only complies to the bare minimum with legal requirements and does not show a detailed breakdown of where the income has come from and on what it's been spent. And this despite the McCanns' claim that they wanted their fund to be transparent. But we don't have time to dwell on the operation of the fund. What we do know is that a significant portion of the fund has been spent on a series of detective agencies and investigators. I'm now going to put them under the microscope. But first, let me explain how the McCanns' private investigation operation has been directed, and by whom. The first thing to say is that the McCanns have always maintained that decisions about the private investigation have been made by the directors of Madeleine's fund, whose names I have mentioned, but the real controller of the McCanns' private investigation all along has been a Cheshire businessman by the name of Brian Kennedy. This is not Kate's uncle, Brian Kennedy, who lives in Rothley. This Brian Kennedy is a major multimillionaire businessman. He lives in a palatial mansion in the Cheshire countryside. He has a large business empire which includes his Latium Group, based in Wilmslow, Cheshire, and double glazing companies such as Weatherseal. His companies have a number of times come under scrutiny for what we might call sharp business practice. Most recently this year, when the now defunct Office of Fair Trading issued a damning report on Kennedy's Weatherseal company. He is perhaps most well known beyond the world of business as the chairman of successful rugby club Sale Sharks, who are also based in Cheshire, and for his bold but unsuccessful attempt to take over Rangers Football Club. But his venture into sport has not always been successful. Under his ownership, Cheshire-based Stockport County Football Club plummeted 4 divisions and out of the Football League. How did Brian Kennedy get involved in being the head of the McCanns' private investigation? In her book, Kate McCann gives this account. On Wednesday the 12th of September, just 3 days after the McCanns had returned from Portugal, Jerry was contacted by Edward Smethurst, a commercial lawyer. He represented a businessman called Brian Kennedy, a successful entrepreneur who owned various companies, including Everest Windows. He said that Brian, like many people, had been following the unfolding drama of Madeleine's disappearance. And now, seeing things going from bad to worse, he could no longer stand idly by and watch. And so it was that just 2 days later, a top London lawyer, Angus McBride from city firm Kingsley Napley drove all the way up from the south to Rothley to pick up the McCanns and drive them to a meeting in London where they met with Kennedy for the first time and a battery of top lawyers. The McCanns claim that it was only after this meeting that Brian Kennedy devised his campaign to run a private investigation to find Madeleine. Kennedy promptly bought a house in Knutsford, again in Cheshire, as the base for his investigation. He and the McCann team have been very secretive about this base, but clips of it were shown in a Channel 4 documentary on the case shown in May 2009. Kennedy made two swift decisions. He appointed an expert in money laundering, Gary Hagland, as his British-based lieutenant, whilst at the same time making the seemingly bizarre decision to appoint a highly controversial Barcelona-based detective agency, Metodo 3, translated as the Third Method, to try and locate Madeleine. So let's take a look at Gary Hagland and what we know about him and his work for Brian Kennedy and the McCann team. Here's a summary of what we know about his personal history. He was born in 1954 and is now 60. He appears to be unmarried. We know that he worked in a branch of the security services in the Criminal Intelligence Department of Hong Kong Royal Police from 1979 to 1985, when he appears to have returned to England and settled in a comfortable apartment in Nottingham. What he did for the next 6 years is a mystery, but in 1991, at the age of 37, we find him employed as an Associate Director of Compliance at accountancy firm Albert E. Sharp & Co. Compliance is an area of practice which deals with complying with ever stricter financial regulations. For him to have become a compliance director, Hagland would have had to have been familiar with all the up-to-date financing and banking regulations, including knowing all about the various scams and schemes associated with money laundering, a major part of the modus operandi of drug lords and other major criminals. In 1993, he published an article also covering money laundering in the Journal of Financial Regulation and Compliance, titled Effective Compliance versus Regulatory Gestation. Clearly, he was very much an acknowledged expert in money laundering by this time. During the 1990s, he suddenly becomes the director of a number of companies whose precise purpose is obscure. And then in 1999, we find an article about him in a journal called Money Laundering Bulletin. 2 years later, in 2001, we find an article about him in the Financial Times Director magazine, where he is described as follows. Gary Hagland is a consultant with law firm Rag & Co, advising clients on the active management of compliance risks, including money laundering. Mr. Hagland paints a broad picture of the type of non-financial services businesses that may well be targets for the money launderer. According to Mr. Hagland, a problem for companies in complying with anti-money laundering activities is that their prevailing culture and ethos does not lend itself readily to accommodate skepticism about prospective customers. Rather, the opposite is likely to be the case. To tackle the possible threat of being unwitting accomplices to a money laundering scheme, the challenge for non-financial businesses is to change their mindset, their core attitudes. The reputational focus of most businesses is clearly not on money laundering, says Mr. Hagland. The risks associated with money laundering are clear enough. Money laundering is a criminal offence. Any individual caught helping to process the proceeds of crime faces a lengthy sentence. Companies which stand accused of assisting with money laundering operations also risk substantial damage to their reputations. But how can you tell a money launderer? Money launderers are extremely well funded, well advised, and make use of technically elaborate and sophisticated schemes to cover their tracks. We are left in no doubt at all. Gary Hagland is a sought-after man because of his experience in one thing in particular, money laundering. So why was it that in September 2007, or maybe even before then, that Cheshire businessman Brian Kennedy hired Hagland as his right-hand man and his liaison officer with the controversial Spanish detective agency Metodo 3? Was it because he had any sort of track record in tracing and finding missing children? Clearly not. Why hire a man who is an acknowledged expert in financial compliance to look for a missing child? Hagland was to carry on working for Brian Kennedy and the McCanns, meeting with investigators from Metodo 3, both in their Spanish headquarters in Barcelona and in Brian Kennedy's headquarters in Knutsford. It's time now then to take a very close look at this Spanish detective agency, Metodo 3. Little has been written up about them in the mainstream British press. The tabloids would merely recycle claims by the McCann's public relations officer, Clarence Mitchell, about what a great detective agency it was, explaining that the Spanish agency was carefully chosen for its reputation and its position close to Portugal. He explained that because Portugal did not allow ongoing private investigations whilst there was an official police investigation, they could not employ a Portuguese agency. The next best thing was a Spanish agency. When the broadsheet papers attempted more in-depth articles about Metodo 3, however, they were much more sceptical. A good example was one by Christine Toomey in the Times. She visited Metodo 3 in February 2008 and was seriously unimpressed by what she saw. Her article was titled, "Madeleine McCann and Metodo 3, Private Eyes, Public Lies." In the autumn of 2007, Metodo boss Francisco Marco claimed that "we believe she is in an area not far from the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa," adding, "we have proof of her movements after her kidnap, and we know she was alive the day after her disappearance. I talk of certainties because we know which group may have her or could have kidnapped her to sell her on. I cannot say who she is with because we are putting together conclusive proof that we can present to authorities." It was all utter lies. 2 months before Toomey's visit, Marco had infamously made a series of boasts headlined in the British media. He first of all claimed that he knew that Madeleine was alive and where she was. Then his claim that his men were closing in on the kidnappers. Finally, he boasted that "Maddie will be home for Christmas." These were the most outrageous, blatant lies. Yet these lies were never condemned by the McCanns. In fact, they carried on using the services of this discredited agency for at least another 15 months, using them until at least March 2009. In her article, Christine Toomey noted that on the very day Mr. Marco bragged about Madeleine McCann being home by Christmas, Metodo 3 moved from a cramped premises above a grocer's shop specialising in sausages in Barcelona's commercial district to a multi-million-pound suite of offices in a grand villa on one of the city's most prestigious boulevards. At the time, Metodo 3 were 4 months into a contract with the McCanns, worth a reported £600,000 in total. How much did the McCann team pay Metodo 3 for their services? On the 29th of November 2007, Jerry McCann on his personal blog wrote that the Find Madeleine Trust was paying the £50,000 a month fees. It was then mostly the generous British public with their generous donations which was funding this detective agency. If the McCanns carried on employing them for 15 months after Francisco Marco's lying boast that "Maddie will be home for Christmas," we must assume that the McCanns were very happy with their work. We will examine more of that work in a moment. Back to Christine Toomey's article in The Times. She made some acid comments on what she found in her visit. There is no discernible ringing telephones, little sign of activity of any kind, other than a woman searching for a lead to take a pet poodle for a walk, and the occasional toing and froing of workmen putting finishing touches to the sleek remodelling of the office complex. Opposite the boardroom is an open-plan area of around half a dozen cubicles, equipped with banks of phones and computers. Most are empty when I arrive. That tended to expose Marco's claims to have 40 people employed full-time or part-time in the search for Madeleine as false. The British press at the time, however, simply printed this unlikely claim without questioning it. Toomey went on to observe how defensive Metodo 3 were about their involvement in the search for Madeleine. Speaking to the boss, Francisco Marco, and his cousin, José Luis, she received this stern warning from Luis: "We don't answer any questions about Maddie. Maddie is off limits. Is that understood?" She continued, "After talking to Marco for half an hour, I concluded that what motivates him, as much as, if not more than his professed desire to present Madeleine with the doll he boasts he carries around in his briefcase to hand to her when he finds her, is a sense of self-regard, self-publicity and money. She added that before its involvement in the Madeleine McCann case, Metodo 3 specialised in investigating financial swindles, industrial espionage and insurance fraud. Money laundering was another of its areas of expertise. There is no evidence that Metodo 3 had any experience whatsoever in searching for, let alone finding, missing children, though they had made a completely false claim to have located 23 children. Toomey describes how her interview with Metodo 3 ended. When I ask Marco to elaborate on the 23 missing children he claims his agency has located in the past, Marco eases himself away from the table for the first time, tilting far back in his chair. He cannot talk about that on the grounds of confidentiality, he says. Shortly after this, his cousin José Louis, who has sat mostly silent until now, calls time on the interview with a chopping motion of his hand. It's clear that Metodo 3 had a very controversial history. One journalist who investigated them by visiting Barcelona spoke to the police and other reputable detective agencies there. All of them, without exception, described Metodo 3 as a disreputable, dodgy, rogue agency. One Spanish private investigator told the Daily Mail, "Metodo 3 have portrayed themselves as the best investigators in the world. The truth is, they are nothing of the sort. Their murky background is riddled with controversy." Why would the McCanns choose the most disreputable private investigation agency going in Barcelona? Metodo 3's boss, Francisco Marco, was described by leading Portuguese criminologist Mr. Moita Flores as a crook, and indeed last year Marco was arrested and charged with spying on a leading Spanish politician by illegally recording her private conversations in a restaurant. It caused a major scandal in Spain. Also arrested with him was his colleague Julian Peribinez, one of Metodo 3's men most involved in the Madeleine McCann case. He soon admitted his guilt, having confessed to planting illegal bugging devices in the restaurant. When spotted by TV cameras walking side by side with the McCann team's private investigation head Brian Kennedy and Pride of Luz, he was keen to avoid them. Many of the Metodo 3 detectives were once arrested in a phone-tapping scandal linked to leading politicians and businessmen. 5 senior members of Metodo 3, including Francisco Marco, were held in 1995 amid claims of industrial and political espionage, with Marco's mother, Martina Fernando Lado, 57, who founded the agency in 1985, being led away in handcuffs. She was arrested as she handed a client a cassette containing an allegedly illegally phone-tapped conversation. At the same time, police raided Metodo 3's Barcelona offices, seizing handguns, ammunition, listening equipment, cassettes and transcripts of illegally taped phone calls. Subsequently, Mrs. Lado was found to have made phone calls offering a telephone tapping service for a fee of around £20,000. Mrs. Lado's husband, Francisco Marco Poilo, and Marco's brother, Francisco Gabriel Fernandez Lado, were also arrested. Also, Sergio Sancelestino, an employee of Spanish telephone company Telefonica, was suspected of illegal phone tapping and was proved to have close links with employees of Metodo 3. Amazingly, the prosecution of Metodo 3 was inexplicably dropped. None of them were convicted at that time for their alleged illegal phone tapping and firearms crimes. Not long after Christmas 2007, the McCann team nearly suffered another major embarrassment when their lead investigator on the Madeleine McCann case, Antonio Giménez Raso, once described as Metodo 3's detective in charge of special operations, was arrested on serious criminal charges. They only escaped embarrassment by some clever spinning of their chief public relations officer, Clarence Mitchell. Antonio Giménez Raso was soon afterwards charged, along with his twin brother, with stealing 400 kilograms of cocaine, nearly half a ton, from an illegal shipment of 1,500 kilograms said to have been worth £25 million on a ship coming from Venezuela. He was also charged with breach of trust, misconduct in a public office, that is, corruption, corruption of public officials and illicit criminal association. The alleged offence occurred in December 2004 and involved what a court was later to describe as an exceptionally violent and ruthless criminal gang involving at least 27 individuals. It emerged that Giménez Raso had until December 2004 worked as a chief inspector in the Drugs and Organised Crime Unit for the Barcelona Regional Police. He had left the police under mysterious circumstances, just when an internal investigation was looking into how those 400 kilos of cocaine had disappeared. He then went to work for the controversial Metodo 3 detective agency in August 2005, joining the McCann's team's private investigation 2 years later. He spent the next 4 years in jail, remanded in custody. After a long process of investigation, during which the criminal gang tried various means, including making violent threats to the prosecutor to disrupt the matter coming to trial, and then try to wreck the trial itself, Gimenez Razo was lucky to escape without punishment, as his active participation in the work of the gang could not be proved. But the judge admonished him sternly, telling him that as a former senior police officer he had become far too close to the gang members. How deeply had Gimenez Razo, this close associate of drugs lords and crime gangsters, been involved in working on the Madeleine McCann investigation? Very deeply. It has now become clear that an early suggestion of the McCanns was to suggest to the world that Madeleine had been stolen to order by a wealthy North African family and was probably in Morocco. The McCanns visited Morocco in June 2007 and promoted Madeleine's disappearance while they were there. A number of people visiting Morocco claimed to have seen Madeleine, but that was at a time when the media frenzy was at its height and Madeleine was being seen here, there and everywhere. Once Brian Kennedy was made the operational head of the McCann's private investigation, and he had appointed Gary Hagland as his liaison man with Metodo 3, the two men lost no time in working out a detailed plan which focused on promoting the notion that Madeleine was most likely in Morocco. Hagland was sent to London to discuss the Moroccan project with a former MI6 colleague who worked on the Foreign Office's Moroccan desk. A huge boost to what we might term the McCann's Moroccan project came when there was a burst of media speculation in late September 2007 about whether a white girl being carried on the back of a Moroccan peasant woman could be Madeleine McCann. As it turned out, the girl, Bushra Bashina, was proved just days later to be a Moroccan girl being carried by her mother. How the photograph of her came to be taken and how the McCanns came to get it before it got to the police remains, like so much else, a deep mystery. It was clearly the McCann team who briefed the press and gave the media the photograph in question. Here is how Kate McCann explains it all in her book. On the 25th of September, we heard that a little blonde girl resembling Madeleine had been spotted with a group of Moroccan peasants. We received a photograph. She doesn't explain who took it, nor how it got to them. She goes on to say that the child looked too young to be Madeleine, adding that the picture was too grainy for us to be absolutely sure. The day the photograph appeared in all the British press, 25th of September, as Kate says, a contingent of the press pack jumped on planes to Morocco to try to track down Madeleine. She then explains that Brian Kennedy called us later that evening to ask if we would like him to fly out to Morocco to find out for certain. Kate says they were not sure this was necessary or wise, but she says off went Brian on his plane, his own private jet, to northern Morocco. It sounds as if this was just a spur-of-the-moment decision by a genuine man, just wanting to do all he could to find Madeleine. However, what Kate McCann appears to omit in her book is that this was no snap decision by Brian Kennedy. It seems he may have pre-arranged to meet Metodo 3's man in Morocco, Antonio Gimenez Razo. The plane flight to Morocco may have been arranged a week or two in advance. The publicity about Bushra Bashina simply appears to have coincided with his pre-planned visit. Antonio Gimenez Razo, a Spaniard, was the McCann team's main man in Morocco, also a Spanish-speaking country. This would enable him to work on the ground in Morocco and converse easily with those he wanted to speak to. The stated purpose of Gimenez Razo being based in Morocco that autumn was simply to find Madeleine. But let's now examine his actual actions. One of his key roles appears to have been simply to look for any witnesses who were prepared to say they might have seen Madeleine alive. There were reports that Gimenez Razo and other Metodo 3 detectives were going around Morocco offering ready cash to anybody who would say that they had seen Madeleine. This was dramatically confirmed by a newspaper report stating that the Moroccan government had taken the highly unusual step of expelling a man who had been visiting hotels and garages in various parts of Morocco, offering people money if they could claim to have seen a girl looking like Madeleine. The report did not name the man or his nationality, but it could well have been Gimenez Razo. After this, we suddenly find Antonio Gimenez Razo and his boss, Francisco Marco, turning up at the Portimao police station, which was the headquarters of the official investigation in Portugal. They were there to talk to the Portuguese police. This was on the 13th of November 2007, and with them for this most important meeting was the man directing the McCann's private investigation, Cheshire multimillionaire Brian Kennedy. So what was this meeting between the Portuguese police and the McCann's private detective all about? It had come about with the help of Gimenez Razo. He had used his various connections with the police in Barcelona to get the Barcelona police chief to ring his opposite number in Portugal and ask for a meeting. He said that Metodo 3 had vital evidence about who might have taken Madeleine. The meeting was duly arranged, and Brian Kennedy jetted in from Cheshire to meet 3 Portuguese police officers. The Metodo 3 men had flown several hundred miles to attend this meeting. Kennedy flew some 1,500 miles. They must have considered it worth it. There, the 3 men wove elaborate and believable tales about 3 possible suspects. The Portuguese police took notes. They followed up what may have seemed promising leads to them. None of them came to anything. The only purpose they served, in fact, was to waste valuable police time. We have established, then, that Gimenez Razo spent 4 years in prison, remanded in custody for offences connected with his associations with members of a violent criminal gang. We have established that the McCann team not only employed him, but that he was the leading detective used by the McCanns. When Gimenez Razo was arrested in February 2008, the press immediately pointed out that he was one of the McCann's private detectives. How did the McCann team react? They denied it outright. Their spokesman, Clarence Mitchell, said, "He is not one of our team." It was an outright, outrageous lie, as we've just shown. That wasn't the only meeting that Brian Kennedy had that day, however. Let's have a quick look at the other meeting he had that evening. His meeting was at a villa near Praia de Luz called Sal Salito. It was at the home of Ralph and Sally Everley, the aunt and uncle of Robert Murat, the man who was made the first formal suspect over the reported disappearance of Madeleine back on the 15th of May that year. So in the distance there you can just see the property of Sal Salito. I'll just point to it. This is it here, the Everley's property, Sal Salito, and this is the location that the Portuguese police searched in connection with the Madeleine McCann disappearance. It was a high-powered meeting. Robert Murat was there, so was his high-powered lawyer, Francisco Pagaret. Brian Kennedy also brought his lawyer along, the equally high-powered lawyer, Edward Smethurst. Smethurst had been for years Brian Kennedy's in-house lawyer for his Latium Group business empire. He had also been appointed, allegedly at a meeting on the 14th of September in London, as the coordinating solicitor for Kate and Jerry McCann. In addition, he was a top Freemason. He is a senior Freemason in the East Lancashire Masonic Province, and is also called Past Worshipful Master of his Lodge. Smethurst had been fully involved in the Masonic movement since his teens, after his father died suddenly in a mysterious fire. His mentor in the lodge was the former head of legal services at British Nuclear Fuels Limited, Alvin Shuttleworth. After he qualified as a lawyer, Smethurst was given the job of assistant legal officer by his mentor Shuttleworth, where he soon became involved in defending compensation claims from leukemia victims in Cumbria who lived near the Sellafield nuclear site. In November 2007, Smethurst appeared in a panorama programme on Madeleine's disappearance.
It was quite clear when Kate and Jerry came back to the UK that they were subject to an open season of abuse in the media. They'd obviously gone through the tragedy of having the daughter taken in very unfortunate circumstances. And to make matters infinitely worse, we're now subject to a trial by media.
So the main question we have to ask about this meeting is, what was it for? Here in the same room together we had the first suspect, Robert Murat, and his lawyer, Smethurst, the lawyer for the second and third suspects, the McCanns, and the McCanns team's head of their private investigation, Brian Kennedy. The meeting was kept secret, but leaked out in local Portuguese newspapers. Kennedy was asked why he had flown out all the way for a private meeting with the then chief suspect, Robert Murat. He replied, "To offer him a job helping to find Madeleine." You can judge for yourself how credible an explanation that was. But we must now move on to examine the role of Antonio Gimenez Raso and his boss, Francisco Marco, in another very bizarre and disturbing set of events. Some of you watching may remember, back in the winter of 2008, the scenes of a team of divers looking in a murky lake for Madeleine's bones. At the very centre of this search for bones was another man we must now introduce. Also part of the Metodo 3 setup, a lawyer called Marcos Aragao Correa. He was a young lawyer in his early 30s who hailed from the island of Madeira. When the story first broke in late 2008, he presented himself as a good Samaritan-type bloke who dipped into his own pocket to fund this search, based, he said, on information received. So what was this information received? He told an extraordinary story. Days after Madeleine was reported missing, he said, what he referred to darkly as underworld sources had told him that Madeleine had been abducted, then raped, then killed, and then her body had been thrown in a murky lake. He said he had told Portuguese police about his information, but they had ignored him. He had then set about working out where this murky lake was, and, using clues received in a vision or a dream, he had got out some maps, toured the area, visited several lakes, and decided that Madeleine's body must be in the Arada Dam. There was a tower by the side of the lake. He had reasoned that if, as he had been told, Madeleine had been thrown in the lake, she must have been thrown in from the tower. Accordingly, he instructed his divers to search just the part of the lake that was near the tower. He, or others, had made sure the media and press were there to record the event, and Britain's mainstream media, as usual, lapped up and uncritically recycled the story as gospel. There was only one problem with the story. It was utter bilge, total lies from start to finish. In the end, Marcos Correa was forced, under the pressure of relentless questioning from the media, to admit that he had told everybody a pack of lies. He said he would now tell the truth. The new story ran as follows. 2 days after Madeleine was reported missing, he went to his first ever spiritualist church meeting. He went home and then had a vision of a huge, powerful man strangling a blonde girl about Madeleine's age. Later, he says, he heard about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and linked his vision with her disappearance, and that is how he became interested in her. Later, another vision of a murky lake came to him, and that, again with the aid of maps, led him to the search of the Arada Dam. Unfortunately for Marcos Correa's credibility, that story also crumbled under pressure, and he had to admit that that one was false as well. To return to the searches of the dam, there were two, one in late January and early February, and another week-long search in March. In each case, a team of British divers was used. Once again, Marcos Correa, under pressure, admitted that another part of his original story was also a lie. He was not, in fact, a good Samaritan after all. He had been paid by Metodo 3 to carry out these searches of the dam. And of course Metodo 3 was being employed by Brian Kennedy on behalf of the McCann team. So in searching this dam, who was this man really working for? Quite plainly, he was working for the McCanns. And as most of the money for employing Metodo 3 was coming from the generosity of the British public, it was our donations that were funding this search. He first of all said that he had paid for these searches of the dam out of his own pocket. In the event, there was much media coverage of both the searches. An item of clothing was found which it was said could be Madeleine's. It wasn't. Then a bag of bones was found, which it was claimed could be Madeleine's. They were ostentatiously passed to the Portuguese police. They weren't Madeleine's bones. They were animal bones. Eventually the searches were called off. But now we come to a still more sinister part of this story, and that is that this search of the Arada Dam was planned at least 7 weeks before it happened. As Marcos Correa later explained in a magazine article, he had met with Francisco Marco and Antonio Gimenez Raso of Metodo 3 at this very Arada Dam on the 10th of December 2007. This may have been the very first time that Marcos Correa had been introduced to the two Metodo 3 investigators. They each had to travel a very long way. For Marco and Gimenez Raso, the trip from their Barcelona base was 700 miles. From Marcos Correa's base on the island of Madeira, it was nearly 1,000 miles. Who was it arranged for this meeting? Correa, as we've seen, worked for Metodo 3. We know that Francisco Marco and Gimenez Raso from Metodo 3 were employed by Brian Kennedy from September 2007. Therefore, all three were Metodo 3 men, appointed by Brian Kennedy on behalf of the McCann team. Therefore, what appeared at first sight to be a genuine effort by a Good Samaritan to check out information he had received that Madeleine's body might have been thrown in the Arada Dam, turns out instead to have been a meticulously planned event by Metodo 3. And in funding this search, with the help of donations from the British public, they were relying, we now find out, on a man who lied through his teeth not once, but twice, about how he came to be interested in what really happened to Madeleine. The more you peer into the events and people behind this search for bones in the Arada Dam, the more it has every appearance of being just a plain stunt designed to grab front-page coverage in the British press. We have to ask, why did the McCanns do this? What was the whole purpose of this exercise? Why did three people employed by the McCanns travel a total of thousands of miles to meet at the dam in December 2007? And why, when news of the search broke in late January, were the British public not informed about the lead-up to this search? Before we leave the subject of Metodo 3, I should just mention that its boss, Francisco Marco, was also involved at the same time as he had the Madeleine McCann contract in a major agricultural scam. This was exposed on the 2nd of February 2009. The case involved embezzlement and money laundering. That was hardly surprising, given Metodo 3's record in involvement in money laundering. Basically, the Catalan regional government had commissioned and paid for a large number of expert reports. But these reports, said a state prosecutor, had no purpose or interest. One of the most blatant examples was the payment of Metodo 3 of nearly £30,000 for a wholly unnecessary socio-economic inquiry on hazelnut farming. The Clean Hands Collective, which campaigns against corruption, found out that the socialist agricultural advisor, Joaquim Lina, had asked Metodo 3 to carry out a hazelnut inquiry. But Metodo 3's report was found to be merely a cut-and-paste job from an internet report on the hazelnut industry in a regional magazine, El Confidencial. In other words, Metodo 3 had got £30,000 for doing nothing of real value. In March 2008, the McCanns ceased using Metodo 3 full-time, but retained their services on a part-time basis. It's time now to look at the extraordinary person the McCanns and Brian Kennedy now put in charge of their search for missing Madeleine. It was a company with the grand title of Oakley International. When news that Metodo 3 had been replaced leaked out in the press, the McCann spokesman Clarence Mitchell described them as the big boys of international private investigation. Once again, the British mainstream press simply reproduced this claim without bothering to look behind it. In fact, Oakley International was basically a one-man band, run by an Irish fraudster and conman, Kevin Halligan. Also involved with him was ex-MI5 friend Henry Exton. We would know very little about Halligan but for a penetrating article published on the 24th of August 2009 by security expert and writer Mark Hollingsworth in the Evening Standard. These were the main facts that he revealed. Brian Kennedy and the men he employed, such as Metodo 3 employees we've looked at, scared off witnesses, talking to them so aggressively that some of them later refused to talk to the police, wasted funds and raised false hopes. Brian Kennedy and his son Patrick had to be questioned by Portuguese police after attempting a rash 24-hour stakeout of a house where they thought Madeleine was being held. She wasn't being held there. The relationship between Metodo 3 and the Portuguese police then completely broke down. Kennedy's investigators had little experience of the required painstaking forensic detective work. In his article, Hollingsworth noted that Exton had once worked for MI5 but was sacked after being arrested, caught leaving a tax-free shopping area at Manchester Airport with a bottle of perfume he had not paid for. He accepted an official police caution. As for Kevin Halligan, Hollingsworth was damning. Halligan used a variety of names. Indeed, when he met the McCanns, he told them his name was Richard Halligan. He falsely claimed to have worked for GCHQ and made other false claims and extravagant claims about himself. In 2006, the year before Madeleine went missing, he secured a contract with Dutch firm Trafigura. They had dumped toxic waste in a landfill site near Abidjan, the main city in Ivory Coast, causing severe physical illness to hundreds of people living nearby. The government had imprisoned some of Trafigura's executives. Trafigura appointed Halligan on a lucrative contract to help with negotiations to release its executives. He failed, meaning that Trafigura had to pay the eye-watering sum of around £125 million to secure the release of its executives. As Hollingsworth pointed out, Halligan made a fortune from Trafigura and was suddenly flying everywhere first class, staying at the Landsborough and Stafford hotels in London and the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. for months at a time. He then went on to describe what Halligan was doing when he was supposed to be working for the McCanns. He actually only worked for them for 4 months, as his 6-month contract was terminated early. During this time he was paid the sum of £500,000 plus expenses. It was a daily rate of about £6,000 a day. On top of that, his first month's expenses claim was nearly £50,000. Yet he had absolutely no experience in tracing and finding missing people. During the Madeleine investigation, says Hollingsworth, Halligan spent vast amounts of time in the Hey Joe bar in the basement of the Abracadabra Club near his Jermyn Street office. Armed with a clutch of unregistered mobile phones and a BlackBerry, the bar was in effect his office. He was there virtually the whole day. He had an amazing tolerance for alcohol. When not imbibing in St. James's, Halligan was in the United States. On the 15th of August 2008, at the height of the McCann investigation crisis, he persuaded Andrea Hollis, a former US Drug Enforcement Agency official, to write out an $80,000 check to Oakley in return for a 10% shareholding. The money was then transferred into the private accounts of Halligan and his girlfriend, Shirin Trakitis, to finance a holiday in Italy. Halligan later faced a $6 million lawsuit in Virginia concerning an allegation that he repeatedly and systematically depleted funds from Oakley's bank accounts for inappropriate personal expenses. He faced a further £1.4 million damages claim from Mark Aspinall, a lawyer who had worked closely with him. He had invested £500,000 with Halligan's Oakley International Company and lost the lot. Hollingsworth added that numerous employees, specialist consultants and contractors hired by Halligan had not been paid, adding that some of them now face financial ruin. Hollingsworth concluded his article by telling us that Halligan was now on the run from his numerous creditors and various law enforcers. It was in October 2009 that a sharp-eyed lady recognised Halligan's face from a photograph in the press. He had been spotted staying at the £700 a night Oxford Hotel with his then-girlfriend. The police bundled him into a van and put him in Belmarsh top security prison. He fought extradition for 3 years, finally being removed to the US, where he pleaded guilty to serious fraud offences. He served a total of 4 years in prison. Once again, we must ask, why did the McCann team turn to an out-and-out fraudster like Kevin Halligan, who had no ability or experience in tracing missing people? The McCann team had on board the McCanns themselves, both doctors, one of the country's most experienced PR experts, Clarence Mitchell, Brian Kennedy, a multi-millionaire businessman, and his commercial lawyer, top Freemason Edward Smethurst. How could the McCanns spend well over £500,000 raised from the caring British public on this man? As one might expect, Kate McCann in her book glosses over this appalling episode, portraying themselves as naive. She wrote, "The first and second phases of the contract, April to July, ran fairly smoothly. Oakley had put in place systems to gather, collate, prioritise and follow up information coming in. There is little doubt at that stage progress was being made. But that simply wasn't true. Halligan achieved nothing. He did not take the investigation one jot closer to finding out who took Madeleine and where she might be. And let's just have a look at these so-called systems that Halligan put in place for following up information coming in. One of these was Halligan's hiring of a company in Virginia in the US to follow up calls to the much-trumpeted investigation hotline promoted by the McCanns. This was a telephone number published on the McCanns' website Find Madeleine, which had the strapline "Pick up the phone and bring Madeleine home." Its director, Johan Selle, however, told the Mail on Sunday that neither the McCann team nor Kevin Halligan nor anyone else had followed up the single call made to the so-called hotline. This was what Daniel Boffey of the Mail on Sunday wrote. The headline ran, "iJet director claims that the McCanns never followed up calls to their telephone hotline. Madeleine McCann investigator didn't listen to any tip-offs given to hotline." He continued, "Perhaps of most concern about Halligan is the lack of attention paid to the hundreds of phone calls received to the Madeleine hotline. Halligan and Oakley International, based in Washington, failed to listen to a single call received on the hotline set up for potential informants by Kate and Jerry McCann last year." Johan Selle, the director of operations at iJet, revealed that for a year nobody even asked his company if they could listen to any of the calls received. He said his operators in Annapolis, Virginia, had answered hundreds of calls, but the information seemed wasted, possibly squandering valuable leads. He said, "We delivered Oakley a report with a summary of the calls, and said if they wanted to come back they could listen to the recording. But nobody did. For someone with an understanding of the case, it would be very easy for some to say that maybe 80 or 90% of the calls were hogwash, but there may be a percentage where one would say, maybe we should listen to this one or listen to that one. But our understanding is that this never took place. We are not sure whether Halligan provided our report to the family, or to the trust, or to those working for them, or to the teams working after him, because no one came back to us. We sent the report to the Oakley Group, and our assumption was that they were using it as a piece in the puzzle. But it appears that wasn't the case. The firm says it was not paid for its services by either Halligan or Oakley International. Time after time the McCanns begged the public to make that one phone call. Help us find the key that will unlock this puzzle. Help us find the missing piece of the jigsaw, and so on. It seems from what Selle told the Mail on Sunday that the hotline was bogus. All you could ever do on the McCann's investigation line was leave a message. Nobody ever got an answer. That would be one thing, but Mr. Selle's evidence suggests that by the spring of 2008, the hotline was a complete sham. The Mail on Sunday article also gave further shocking particulars about what Kevin Halligan was actually doing whilst he was supposed to be looking for Madeleine. Here is more from Daniel Boffey's article. Halligan squandered more than £500,000. In just 1 month, for example, he spent more than £3,000 just on dining out with his girlfriend. In fact, whilst supposedly working to find Madeleine, he launched an extraordinary spending spree on hotels, restaurants and luxury goods. In his first 2 months as lead investigator in the search for Madeleine, Halligan spent £7,000 on a personal chauffeur. Later, on a short trip to New York with a girlfriend, he lavished $1,600 on Salvatore Ferragamo leather goods, £5,500 on handbags, £500 on an Italian meal, £150 on a pair of designer glasses, and £900 on a 3-night stay at a 5-star Renaissance hotel. Already the owner of a £1.5 million mansion, he also paid out during this time more than £50,000 on plumbing and mosaic tiling for his house in Great Falls, Virginia. He spoke of extravagant schemes he was developing to catch the abductor. One of the more bizarre claims was that he hired an actor to pretend to be a drunken priest, who would seek confessions as he toured the bars of Praia de Luz, the resort where Madeleine disappeared. He told others that a family with a Madeleine look-alike daughter had been paid to set up home in a nearby resort in order to tempt out a potential kidnapper. There is no evidence that he did either of those things. Indeed, acquaintances describe him as a Walter Mitty character. After being pursued by creditors demanding to be paid for work done helping him, Halligan fled to Rome with Miss Trascitis. Almost immediately after arriving in Rome on their first-class Lufthansa tickets, Halligan withdrew hundreds of thousands of pounds more from Oakley International's bank accounts, was seen drinking and spending prodigiously at the Hilton Cavalieri and Excelsior hotels in Rome, before quietly slinking back to the UK a few months later. Halligan was a fraudster, conman and thief. He served 4 years for some of his frauds. The McCanns, Clarence Mitchell, Brian Kennedy and Edward Smethurst are all top-notch professional and business people. How can we possibly explain this high-powered group of professional people employing such a low-life fraudster for the task of looking for Madeleine and the person who allegedly abducted her? It's a question which cries for a clear answer, but the McCanns have never given us that clear answer. We must therefore use our own gifts of inference to try and work out what was the real reason they employed him. We've looked so far at the first two phases of the McCanns' private investigation. Phase 1, the employment of the most disreputable detective agency in Barcelona, Metodo 3, together with the employment in England of expert in money laundering and financial compliance, Gary Hagland. And Phase 2, their employment of Kevin Halligan, a serial conman and convicted fraudster. Gary Hagland's speciality was money laundering. Metodo 3 was a thoroughly disreputable detective agency who were frequently involved in or suspected of criminal activity. Halligan was an out-and-out fraudster and liar, another criminal. 3 Metodo 3 men who worked on the Madeleine McCann case, Francisco Marco, Julian Parabanez and Antonio Gimenez Raso, have all spent time in jail following allegations of criminal activity. One of them, Gimenez Raso, being in jail for 4 years. Kevin Halligan was also jailed for 4 years. None of these agencies or individuals unearthed one single usable fact about who might have taken Madeleine or where she was. Between them, the McCanns probably paid them a total of well over £1.5 million, with absolutely no result. Where is the mainstream media's coverage of these extraordinary facts? Nowhere. This brings us back to the reason why Clarence Mitchell, the head of Tony Blair's media monitoring unit, was appointed to the job of being the head of PR for the McCanns. He once boasted to a Spanish magazine, L'Espresso, "I was the head of the 40-strong Central Office of Information Media Monitoring Unit. My job there was to control what comes out in the media." Enough said, I think. After the McCann team sacked Halligan in August or September 2009, Brian Kennedy turned to 2 local contacts to head up the McCann team's investigation. One was former Detective Inspector Dave Edgar, who lives in Crewe, just a few miles from Brian Kennedy's mansion. The other was another retired police officer, Arthur Cowley, who lived in a hilltop cottage on Holcombe Mountain, in Flintshire, North Wales. Their main activity over the next 3 years seemed to have been to promote a series of unlikely stories about who might have abducted Madeleine, which I'll look at in a moment. But first, let's look at yet another deception perpetrated by the McCann team in relation to these men. In truth, they were men local to Brian Kennedy, handpicked by him to work in his investigation office in Knutsford, Cheshire. But Kennedy and the McCann team tried to pass the 2 men off as heading up an already established and successful private investigation agency. They chose to mislead the press and the general public in thinking that Dave Edgar was the boss of a successful detective agency called Alpha Investigations Group. There was only one problem with this. There was no such detective agency. It was just 2 men chosen by Kennedy and working completely under his direction. It was not what it seemed, but the McCann team's strategy was brilliantly successful. The mainstream press simply lapped up the misinformation coming from the McCann team's PR men. In a moment I'll explain how this deception was perpetrated, but first let's look at the way mainstream press simply recycled the McCann team's deception over Alpha Investigations Group. One of the first mentions of this bogus Alpha Investigations Group came in the article in the Belfast Telegraph on the 13th of September 2009, and in a parallel article based on the same source in the Independent's Sunday Life magazine. The article claimed that Sunday Life can now lift the lid on how Edgar's Alpha Investigations Group private eye agency really operates. Renowned for leaving no stone unturned in his UK murder investigations, Dave now spends his days with a 4-strong team probing every lead that comes into his office. The article referred to his business partner, Arthur Cowley. This was no lifting of any lid. It was simply the media printing what the McCann team was telling them about Dave Edgar. In fact, it is us here at Rich Planet TV who are now lifting the lid on this and all the other things about this private investigation that have been deliberately hidden from the public until now. It was, however, back on the 14th of May 2009 that the Daily Mirror first mentioned the bogus Alpha Investigations Group. The article praised Edgar to the skies for being one of the most brilliant detectives Britain has ever had, citing his alleged work in solving the murder of Gary Newlove. The Mirror then told us that Edgar found himself at the heart of several successful murder investigations in Cheshire, whatever that might mean. The Mirror then told its readers Mr. Edgar now runs the Alpha Investigations Group with business partner Arthur Cowley. In a Daily Star report a week later, the McCann team's PR spokesman Clarence Mitchell was quoted as saying that Mr. Edgar is following a potentially vital new lead. For operational purposes, I cannot say where Mr. Edgar and his team are exactly, but they are following up a very encouraging lead. Mr. Edgar believes Maddie could be hidden in peasant villages close to the Algarve resort of Praia de Luz, where she was snatched. Mitchell misleadingly referred to Edgar and his team. It was not Edgar's team, it was Brian Kennedy's. Then The Independent on the 23rd of May chipped in with a long article by Cahal Milmo. Once again, Edgar and Cowley were portrayed as amongst the most dedicated and brilliant detectives in the land. Milmo then claimed newly retired detectives and their uniformed counterparts are entering the nebulous and lucrative world of private investigation, such as those running the Alpha Investigation Group, the company headed by former detectives Dave Edgar, 52, and Arthur Cowley, 57, which has been employed since last year by the Find Madeleine Fund. Pausing there, The Independent in this one sentence has claimed two key things. One, that there was a company called Alpha Investigations Group, and two, that the Find Madeleine Fund was employing this company. Other media quickly followed suit. On the 26th of May, the thisischeshire.co.uk news website referred to Dave Edgar and Arthur Cowley, the duo who now run the Alpha Investigations Group. The previous day, the Daily Telegraph had claimed on the 25th of May, stating, "The search for Madeleine is now being headed by two retired policemen, Dave Edgar, a former RUC and Cheshire police officer, and Arthur Cowley, previously of Merseyside Police, who run Alpha Investigations Group." One newspaper even referred to a claim that the McCanns have used the company since some time the previous year, i.e. 2008. These claims essentially portrayed Alpha Investigations Group as a long-established, successful private detective agency headed by Dave Edgar. None of it was true, as we shall now see. These are the facts. 1. There never was a company involving Messrs. Edgar and Cowley called Alpha Investigations Group. 2. A company with a similar name was, however, formed several weeks after all these stories appeared in the press. 3. It was called Alpheg, not Alpha Investigations Group, and was formed on the 16th of June 2009, nearly 5 weeks after Alpha Investigations Group received its first public mention in the Mirror. 4. Alpheg was formed as a one-man band company with Cowley as the sole director. 5. The base of Alpheg was not in Cheshire, as claimed in the mainstream media. It was Arthur Cowley's home in the Flintshire Hills. 6. In fact, Edgar and Cowley were operating from Kennedy's office in Knutsford. 7. Dave Edgar, who was portrayed in the mainstream press as the director of this allegedly successful company, in fact had nothing to do with it. He was neither the owner, nor even a director, nor even a shareholder. 8. Alpheg had no employees. 9. Alpheg has never had any presence on the internet. 10. Alpheg had no assets to speak of. 11. There was no evidence that Alpheg had ever traded. 12. Alpheg never had an office. Apart from Edgar and Cowley using Kennedy's Knutsford house, its registered address was Treetops, Pant y Goff, Halcan, Flintshire, CH8 8DH. 13. The company was numbered 069-29397 and incorporated on the 10th of June 2009. 14. Its sole owner was Arthur John Cowley. There is no mention of Dave Edgar being involved with this company at all. We can also demonstrate that the McCann team were actually behind the creation of Cowley's Alpheg company. On the 12th of January 2009, a full 5 months before Cowley's company was registered at Companies House, the domain name alpheg.co.uk was registered by one Andrew Dickman. It turned out that he was a business partner of Brian Kennedy. The Manchester Evening News said on the 21st of May 2007 that a property business owned by shale sharks and Everest double glazing chain tycoon Brian Kennedy has secured a £60 million funding boost for expansion. Patrick Properties was established in 2002 by Mr. Kennedy and Managing Director Andrew Dickman. Maybe using his friend and business partner Andrew Dickman to register this domain name was meant to conceal the involvement of the McCann team and Brian Kennedy in setting up the bogus Alfeg company. Well, if so, it hasn't worked. As so, we have established that all the media stories about Alpha Investigations Group are untrue. Amazingly, Edgar himself admitted this by stating that he was not part of Alpha Investigations in what was a highly critical article about the Madeleine McCann private investigation published on the 15th of August 2009. This was a story about the McCann team searching for an Australian woman who looked like Victoria Beckham. It was one of the most ridiculous stories the McCann team ever produced, so let's have a quick look at it now. It was, for a start, a story or a lead to which the McCann team attached great importance. They even held a special news conference to promote it. It was so important that the McCann's chief reputation manager, Clarence Mitchell, chaired the press conference, with their lead investigator, Dave Edgar, present as well. They had maps and artist sketches at the ready. We might note, first of all, that this latest lead is said to have taken place in Barcelona, the HQ of the dodgy Spanish detective agency Metodo 3. The outline of this story ran as follows. A British businessman, said to be a banker, has been agonizing for 2 years about an encounter he had on the dockside of Barcelona, Spain, 3 nights after the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Now, after 2 years of agonizing, he had come forward. Not to the police, but to the McCann team. He said that he had been drinking in Barcelona's bars for several hours that evening. Indeed, one newspaper described him as a stag night reveller. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a woman with an Australian accent had approached him. She asked him, "Have you got my new daughter?" He said no. She looked a bit like Victoria Beckham. It was suggested that Madeleine might have come on a boat from Portugal round the Mediterranean to Barcelona, and that the woman was arranging to meet a man on the Barcelona dockside so that she could take her as her new daughter on a yacht to Australia. And that was it. On this slender foundation, the McCann team organised a press conference at which dozens of journalists and cameramen turned up. Edgar claimed it was not only a lead, but a strong lead, and indeed this story prompted a worldwide alert and search for the woman in Australia. Let us now turn to the damning criticism in the Mail on Sunday of this little episode. Days previously, an earlier article by Jerry Lawton had proclaimed that detectives hunting missing Madeleine McCann are to quiz the skipper and crew of a £6 million super yacht. The move came after its millionaire owner, Rhonda Wiley, 52, and daughter Melissa Carlson, 31, vowed to do all they could to help. The 105-foot yacht was spotted in a Barcelona marina 3 days after Madeleine disappeared in 2007. The vessel, flying an Australian flag, was moored close to where the Aussie Posh Spice lookalike approached a Brit stag night reveller and muttered, "Are you here to deliver my daughter?" But Tom Warden, Martin Delgado and Andrew Chapman in the Mail on Sunday took apart this so-called strong lead. They said private detectives leading the hunt for Madeleine McCann faced questions last night after a Mail on Sunday investigation revealed shortcomings in chasing a strong lead. Edgar's Detectives 1 failed to make even rudimentary inquiries before announcing a significant development in the worldwide search for the 6-year-old. 2. Failed to speak to anyone working at the seafood restaurant near where the alleged agitated woman was seen at 2 a.m. 3. Failed to ask the Port Authority about movement of boats around the time Madeleine disappeared. 4. Failed to ask if the mystery woman had been filmed on CCTV. 5. Knew nothing about the arrival of an Australian luxury yacht just after Madeleine vanished until told by British journalists who gave them the captain's mobile number. 6. Failed to interview anyone at a nearby dockside bar where, according to Mr. Edgar, the mystery woman was later seen drinking. And 7. Failed to ask British diplomats in Spain for advice before or during the visit. Also, Spanish police could not confirm that they had ever been contacted by the British investigators. The Mail on Sunday attacked Edgar's failure to question several people who might have had vital information before calling a news conference. But then maybe dramatic news headlines were all that the McCann team really wanted from the story. The Mail on Sunday spoke to José Luis Lopez, owner of the El Rey de la Gamba restaurant where the mystery woman was seen. He said the McCann's private detectives did not make any enquiries at my restaurant. I am almost always here when the restaurant is open, and my staff would have informed me if anyone had approached them about such an important matter. You are the first person to ask about this Australian woman. The manager of the bar next door, Kennedy's Irish Sailing Bar, said the same. The Barcelona port director, Juan Guitar, asked about it. He said, "Nobody has been here asking questions about Madeleine for this Australian woman. This is the first I have heard about any possible link to the port." A senior Port Authority worker added, "There are several security cameras monitoring the port, but we have not been approached about footage from the night in question. I would have expected anyone carrying out the investigation to at least have asked about it." A source at the British Embassy in Madrid said, "The detectives didn't inform us or the consulate in Barcelona that they were coming to Spain, nor ask any help in their investigation." A highly experienced private detective with over 20 years' work tracing missing people added, "I can't understand why the Madeleine detectives would have released this story and leave it to the public without first making their own investigations in the port. It beggars belief that they did not speak to the owner of the restaurant or the port authorities." The McCann detectives had not even checked port records for the dates of the 6th and 7th of May, the days the British banker was in Barcelona. The Mail on Sunday, however, managed to see them, and traced 9 boats that arrived in the port, one of which was unfamiliar. It was a £6 million Sunseeker powerboat, Willpower, owned by an Australian multimillionairess, Rhonda Wiley. The Mail on Sunday interviewed the captain. They commented, "Mr. Edgar's team are in the embarrassing position of having to explain why it was left to reporters to discover the boat's presence in Barcelona and trace its former captain." The Mail on Sunday article was interesting for another reason. The McCann team sought to blame Edgar's assistant, Arthur Cowley, for the Barcelona debacle. Asked to explain himself, Edgar said, "We are a small team. Mr. Cowley's company had no connection with the Madeleine investigation. I am employed by the McCann family and I pick my staff." In these words, Edgar had effectively blown apart the claim that he was the boss of the imaginary Alpha Investigations Group. He, not Alpha Investigations Group, had been hired by the McCanns, and Alpheg was Cowley's company, not Edgar's as the mainstream press had consistently claimed. There was also one truly extraordinary statement made by Dave Edgar at this press conference. He referred to the abductor. He said the abductor might have been a woman, not a man. The statement completely beggared belief. The McCann's close friend, Jane Tanner, had insisted that at 9:15 p.m. she had seen a man carrying a girl in pyjamas near the McCann's apartment. She described his long, sleek black hair, his dark jacket, his mustard-coloured chino trousers, and his black winkle-picker shoes. The description was given to the world. Only 5.5 months later, a ridiculous delay, did the McCann team publish this artist's sketch of the man said to have been seen by Jane Tanner. The sketch was circulated worldwide, being represented as the man who abducted Madeleine McCann. How then could Dave Edgar possibly say that Jane might have seen a woman, not a man? Clearly this led to people wondering if Jane Tanner's so-called sighting was a complete fabrication. Despite the fiasco of their attempt to pin the abduction of Madeleine on a young Australian woman who looked like Victoria Beckham, the McCann team, with the help of Dave Edgar, continued to work on a series of highly improbable stories about what really happened to Madeleine McCann. Let's move on to look at just one or two of the unbelievable stories developed by Dave Edgar. One of the angles the McCann team and Dave Edgar focused on was the possibility that Madeleine might be being held in an underground prison lair. This followed some well-publicised, appalling stories of how girls had been kidnapped and held for years before finally gaining freedom. There was the case of Natasha Kampusch, abducted by Wolfgang Pricklapil when 10 years old and held for 8 years before gaining her freedom. Then there was J.C. Lee Dugard, kidnapped by sex offender Philip Craig Garrido when aged 11 and held for 18 years before being freed. Then there was the evil Joseph Fritzl, who had held his daughter Elizabeth captive for 24 years and fathered 7 children by her. More recently, there was the case of the 3 teenage girls held captive in Arizona for 2 years. Although the circumstances of what happened to these girls was very different from what the McCanns say happened to Madeleine, this did not stop Dave Edgar strongly promoting what he said was his sincere conviction that Madeleine was being held in a prison lair in the so-called lawless hills that surrounded the village of Praia de Luz, the village where she was reported missing. Despite these repeated claims, the McCann team never devoted any of the millions of pounds donated by the generous British public to make a single inquiry in the area. One storyline developed by the McCann team was to try to suggest that Madeleine was abducted by a notorious British paedophile then living in Germany, Raymond Hewlett. He had, it is true, been staying in a camper van in Portugal, about 30 miles from Praia de Luz, at the time Madeleine disappeared, but at the time he was in his late 50s and looked nothing like the man said to have been seen by Jane Tanner, and there were other indications that he could not have carried out the abduction. Hewlett died in December 2009, but that did not stop another attempt in which the McCann team were clearly deeply involved to bring his name into the search for Madeleine. Other newspapers quickly recycled the story on their front pages. "I know who took Madeleine McCann. Deathbed letter from paedophile suspect makes abduction clue claim." A paedophile suspected of being involved in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann confessed to knowing what happened to the little girl on his deathbed, it has been claimed. Raymond Hewlett wrote to his estranged son denying he played a part in the 3-year-old's abduction, but claimed he knew she had been stolen to order by a gypsy gang. Cancer sufferer Hewlett, who has a record of raping and abducting children, had previously claimed to have seen the missing toddler twice before she vanished in 2007. The story was literally incredible. It featured Wayne Hewlett, a builder from Telford, the long-time estranged son of Raymond Hewlett. Raymond Hewlett had been convicted of a string of sex offences, and his son Wayne had disowned him over 20 years previously. But the son solemnly told us in an exclusive Hewlett, whilst dying on his deathbed in a hospital in Aachen, Germany, had written his son a letter giving information about what really happened to Madeleine McCann. Hewlett told the son that a mystery man had brought this letter all the way from Germany. No one has yet volunteered who this so-called mystery man might be. The letter, so it is claimed, said the man years ago, Wayne's father, had been sitting around a gypsy campfire drinking with a gypsy gang leader. The letter gave the name of the gypsy gang leader and said that the gang leader had admitted to Hewlett that members of his gang had stolen Madeleine to order on behalf of a wealthy North African family who wanted a young white girl in their family. One would think that any responsible person would have immediately contacted their local police station and handed them the letter allegedly containing the name of this gypsy gang leader. Instead, Wayne said that he had become emotional about it and burnt it. Having burnt it, he later decided to tell the McCann team, or the Sun, about the story. We can't be sure which came first, but what we can be sure about is that the McCann team and the Sun cooperated once again to put this story on their front page on the 1st of September 2010. In this final section of our in-depth look at the Madeleine McCann case, we are going to look at a significant aspect of this case which simply cries out to be explored. And that is the quite remarkable extent to which the British government and other political, media and establishment figures at the very highest level have been involved in actively assisting the McCanns and in promoting their claim that Madeleine had been abducted right from the very first day Madeleine was reported missing. So let's begin right away by introducing all the top-level people who rushed out to Praia de Luz in the first week after Madeleine's parents first alerted the authorities that Madeleine was missing. In doing so, let us bear in mind that it was always possible that Madeleine might have wandered off, or that she could have been recovered from wherever she had been taken. One presumes that all those who rushed out to Praia de Luz were doing so in a bid somehow to find out what happened to Madeleine McCann and hopefully find her alive. But as we take a much closer look at who rushed to get involved, we begin to wonder quite what was the agenda of some of these people and groups. An obvious place to start is by looking at what consular help the McCanns received from the British ambassador in Portugal. At the time Madeleine McCann was reported missing, Tony Blair was the British Prime Minister. His Foreign Secretary was David Miliband. His Chancellor of the Exchequer was Gordon Brown. The Blair government was renowned for the fortune of taxpayers' money spent on his PR men, spinners, or as some have called them, professional liars. A key person in this exercise in controlling the media was the head of the government's so-called Media Monitoring Unit in the Central Office of Information. It reported straight to the Cabinet Office at number 10 Downing Street. At its head was Clarence Mitchell, the very man who for the next 7 years was to be the main point of contact for the media covering the Madeleine McCann story. As we saw in the first programme in this series, when asked what his role was at the Media Monitoring Unit, Mitchell answered without hesitation to control what comes out in the media, which is exactly what he has done for the past 7 years. And we know from a Freedom of Information request that Clarence Mitchell was formally appointed to head up the Madeleine McCann PR campaign on Sunday the 6th of May, barely 48 hours after Madeleine had been reported missing. What was it, we might well ask, which was so important about this story that the head of the government's main media unit needed to be sent out to Portugal full-time to cover this story? What exactly was the government's interest? What could a PR man do to help find out what happened to Madeleine McCann? Another leading civil servant sent out to pry de Luz was Sherry Dodd, a left-wing journalist who worked for the Daily Mirror before Tony Blair appointed her his Special Foreign Office Ambassador to the McCanns the very next day after Madeleine's disappearance. That now makes 2 very high-up civil servants dispatched to Portugal within 48 hours. It was described in some media as unprecedented. Dodd had been a long-serving senior spokeswoman for the government. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office announced that she was being deployed as the press officer responsible to act as media liaison officer for the McCann family. She flew out immediately to be at the McCann's side for press conferences and to attend police interviews. Her instructions, so far as the public were concerned, were to offer every possible consular assistance to the McCanns. But it seems clear that right from the start her instructions were to do a lot more than that. Because of an international British government letter leaked to a Belgian newspaper, Le Dernier Heure, this is what the Belgian newspaper informed its readers. 1. An unnamed diplomat warned the government in a letter of inconsistencies in the witness statements testimonies by Madeleine's parents and their friends about the night she was reported missing, adding people were not where they claimed to be. 2. After visiting the McCanns, the diplomat voiced concerns about the confused declarations as to the precise whereabouts of Kate and Gerry McCann and their friends in the final hours before Madeleine's disappearance. 3. The letter went on to comment on the McCanns' lack of cooperation with the Portuguese police. 4. The letter stated that a senior civil servant at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office had earlier suggested to consular staff that they exceed their authority and put pressure on the Portuguese authorities. 5. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London had commanded that British embassy staff give all possible assistance to the McCann couple. 6. Diplomats were told the McCanns must be accompanied at all times during any contact with the Portuguese police by either A member of consular staff, or B, by British police officers sent out from the UK. We will come to the nature of the British police sent out to Portugal in a moment. 7. The author of the letter warned London of the risks of siding with the McCanns as completely as had been demanded. It said, "With the greatest respect, I would like to make you aware of the risks and implications to our relationship with the Portuguese authorities if you consider the possible involvement of the couple. Please confirm to me, in the light of these concerns, that we want to continue to be closely involved in the case as was requested in your previous message." None of the contents of this explosive report from a British diplomat have ever been mentioned in the British press. We cannot be sure who was the author of this damning report, but all indications suggest that it was the senior Foreign Office civil servant we mentioned just now, Sherry Dodd. We do know on the record that Sherry Dodd's work in Portugal came to a sudden end on the 17th of May 2007, just a fortnight after Madeleine's disappearance. The indications are that Sherry Dodd compiled her damning letter within a day or two of her arrival in Portugal. She seems to have been the one person in the entire British government who was bold enough to express any doubt about the McCann's claim that Madeleine had been abducted. In 2008, a Freedom of Information request was made to try and obtain disclosure of the contents of all communications between the British Embassy in Portugal and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. This was denied on the grounds that the release of such information would in some way endanger or irreparably damage international relations between the UK and Portugal. The first government minister to get involved in the case was Gordon Brown. At the time, he had been Tony Blair's Chancellor of the Exchequer for 10 years. He was shortly to become Britain's Prime Minister. We know two specific things about his close involvement in the Madeleine McCann case in the first 3 weeks after Madeleine was reported missing. First, we know from Gerry McCann himself, and this has never been denied, that he made several mobile telephone calls to Gordon Brown himself.
Don't you agree that there were a lot of details that in a certain way contribute to people to doubt of you? For example, when you went to the Vatican so quickly, all the contacts that you've made. Can I ask you, Gerry, if you personally know Mr. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister?
No, and we still, we've never met Gordon Brown. We've spoken to him once on the phone several weeks after Madeleine was abducted.
Second, we know that Gordon Brown leaned on the Portuguese authorities to persuade them to release a description of a man with a child that the McCann's friend insisted had been near their apartment at about 9:15 p.m. the night she was reported missing. The McCanns and Jane Tanner had told the Portuguese about this alleged sighting in the hours following Madeleine's reported disappearance. But the Portuguese police, right from day one, thought her so-called sighting was fabricated. They did not want to release details of this sighting as they thought it would mislead the public. However, it is known that Gordon Brown spoke on the telephone to the Portuguese authorities, demanding that they allow Jane Tanner's sighting to be reported and asking for the public's help in identifying the suspect. And so it was on the 25th of May 2007, over 3 weeks after Madeleine had been reported missing, that Gerry McCann and his PR spokesman Clarence Mitchell summoned the world's press to make this announcement. The Portuguese police later released the same description, but in a very low-key announcement. The McCanns had got their announcement, but no artist's sketch or e-fit accompanied Gerry McCann's description. That was partly because Jane Tanner said she had seen the man sideways on and didn't see his face. It was also dark at that time, 9:15 p.m. It was an almost unbelievable 5.5 months later that the McCann team did produce an artist's sketch, and this was it. It was hard to know what good this would do so long after the event, and without a face. When the sketch was eventually released, the British press obligingly and uncritically published it on all the front pages. Of course, it didn't lead to anyone being identified, but it did powerfully reinforce the idea that Madeleine really had been abducted in the public's mind. But why was Gordon Brown so much involved in this? He was not the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband was. And why was the government so much involved as to seek to force an obviously very reluctant Portuguese police force to allow a description of a man which had every appearance of being fabricated released to the world? Why would Gordon Brown not allow the Portuguese police to get on with their investigation unhampered? As we shall see a bit later, Gordon Brown got even more involved when he became Prime Minister. Tony Blair resigned as Prime Minister on the 27th of June 2007 to make way for Gordon Brown. But he and his wife Sherry were in direct touch with Gerry and Kate McCann. In fact, as Kate McCann relates on pages 118 and 119 of her book, she took a call from Sherry Blair at about 5 p.m. on Tuesday the 8th of May, just 5 days after Madeleine's disappearance. According to Kate, Sherry Blair said it was amazing but encouraging that Madeleine was still the first topic on the news every night. Sherry Blair also put her in touch with the controversial founder of Parents and Abducted Children, Lady Catherine Meyer. It was less than 48 hours after this conversation that on the 10th of May 2007, Tony Blair announced that he would resign as Prime Minister the following month. Let me now switch the focus to the holiday company used by the McCanns and their friends, Mark Warner. There was no obvious reason why Mark Warner should pull in some of the biggest guns available in the world of PR, but they certainly did. Mark Warner retained the controversial PR firm Bell Pottinger. Controversial, among other reasons, because they were hired at a fee of tens of millions of pounds to provide PR for the highly undemocratic Democratic Republic of Congo. Their support for this repressive regime recently brought protesters outside Bell Pottinger's Fleet Street offices, campaigning against Bell Pottinger's involvement in supporting the odious regime. Bell Pottinger is also paid tens of millions of pounds by other badly run African states. If Madeleine McCann had been abducted, it was not from a property owned by Mark Warner. Moreover, the McCanns had refused to employ evening childcare facilities laid on by Mark Warner at the Ocean Club premises where they were staying. They used neither the evening creche nor the baby listening service. Alex Woolfall, the head of crisis management at Bell Pottinger, one of the most senior men there, was dispatched immediately, arriving the following day on the 4th of May. Yet, as we've been pointing out, as far as anyone knew at that stage, Madeleine could have been found any day. How exactly the presence of the head of crisis management at Bell Pottinger could help in the police search for Madeleine is not clear at all. One of the strangest things about this involvement is that no sooner had he arrived in Praia de Luz than he got hold of the McCann's cameras and began an immediate search for what was on them. He did so together with the McCann's relative from Skipton, Michael Wright. Quite why he did that is uncertain. One of the leading mysteries in the case is why the so-called last photo produced by the McCanns, allegedly taken at precisely 2:29 p.m. on the day Madeleine was reported missing, was not produced until a full 3 weeks later. Why, if it was on the camera on the 3rd of May, was it not released for 3 weeks? Why, in fact, did the head of crisis management at the powerful media relations firm of Bell Pottinger need to look at the McCann's camera at all? In her book, Madeleine, Kate McCann gives an interesting, if selective, account of the events leading to Jerry McCann's emotional statement to the media at 10 p.m. on the day after Madeleine's reported disappearance. What is interesting is the sheer volume of important people milling around the McCanns by 5 p.m. on the 4th of May, just 19 hours after the McCanns had first reported her missing, and just 8 to 9 hours after the first news reports went out on Sky News, the BBC and ITV. Helpfully, she lists some of them. Alex Woodfall, head of crisis management, Bell Pottinger public relations firm. Top staff from Mark Warner in Portugal, John Hill, Ocean Club manager, Emma Knights and Craig Mayhew. The British ambassador to Portugal, John Buck. British Embassy press officer, Andy Bowes. The British consul for Lisbon, Liz Dow. The local British consul, Bill Henderson, with a colleague, Angela Morado. Alan Pike, a trauma psychologist from the Centre of Crisis Psychology in Skipton, North Yorkshire. Some of the McCann's relatives had already arrived, Kate's mother and father and her aunt Nora, who had cancelled a flight back to Canada where she lived so as to be able to fly out to Portugal. So far as support from the British Embassy was concerned, the support and level of backup in respect of a child who had been reported missing just a few hours ago was totally unprecedented. Why did so many of them need to be there? In addition to all the many people we've already mentioned, we need to look at the involvement of the British security services, an aspect which has rarely been mentioned in the British mainstream press, about which the government has been singularly evasive. Two men from CRG had discussions with the McCanns and were certainly there within days, despite Dr. Gerald McCann saying in late May to a TV interviewer that they had no plans to employ private investigators. They were Kenneth Farrow and Michael Keenan. Mr. Farrow is the ex-head of the Economic Crime Unit in the City of London Police, and Mr. Keenan an ex-superintendent in the Metropolitan Police with specialist fraud and investigative experience. The McCanns were asked if, now that they had already netted £300,000 in their No Stone Unturned fund, they would use any of that money for private investigators. Jerry McCann responded, "The advice we have received is that private investigators will not help at the moment." Despite this clear claim, a private investigation agency known as Control Risks Group announced in September that they had been helping the McCanns since May and were in regular contact with them throughout. In the early afternoon of Sunday the 13th of May 2007, Jane Tanner, one of the McCanns' friends and the person who says she saw an abductor, spoke to some of the people Kate and Jerry brought in. She was referring to Control Risks Group. Who brought them in and who agreed to pay for them? Why were Control Risks Group brought in so soon? To find a missing child or for other reasons? The involvement of the British security services very often means that the government has taken a keen interest in the matter. So just what was the government's interest in the mystery of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann? Now we come to yet another government agency which was involved from day one, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Agency, or CEOP. This was an agency dedicated to the protection of children, especially from child sexual abuse, online grooming and child trafficking. It was absorbed into the National Crime Agency by the coalition government 2 years ago and no longer exists in a separate entity. At the time of Madeleine's disappearance, its head was the controversial figure of Jim Gamble. I say controversial because Gamble will forever be associated with Operation O, the investigation into those allegedly accessing images of child sexual abuse on a website. You could only access this website by paying by credit card online. A lot of UK users of this United States website was passed to the British authorities and handed to Jim Gamble and his team to investigate. Let's just go to Wikipedia and see what they have to say about Operation O and about its head, Jim Gamble. It was the United Kingdom's biggest ever computer crime investigation, leading to 7,250 suspects identified, 4,283 homes searched, 3,744 arrests, 1,848 people charged, 1,451 convictions, 493 people cautioned, and 140 children removed from suspected dangerous situations, and an estimated 33 suicides. Operation O identified and prosecuted some sex offenders, but the validity of the police procedures was later questioned, as errors in the investigations resulted in large numbers of false arrests. Its chief executive, Jim Gamble, was accused of using vague terms which do not have a recognised meaning within either child protection or law enforcement when they defended the operation. This accusation came from an article by Charles Arthur in The Guardian. Coincidentally, it was published on the 17th of May, just a fortnight after Madeleine's reported disappearance. Within days of Madeleine's disappearance, Jim Gamble, just like Alex Woolfall of Bell Pottinger, was on the hunt for photographs, without, it seems, asking the Portuguese police for permission. Gamble begged the British public who had been on holiday the week the McCanns were there to send their holiday snaps. Quite why he thought this would help the Portuguese investigation is unclear. Indeed, we don't know if he ever sent these photographs to the Portuguese police. But CEOP had another controversial role in the initial stages of this investigation. The coordinator of the Portuguese investigation was Dr. Gonçalo Amaral. He wrote a book on the case and he was controversially removed from the investigation. The book was called The Truth About a Lie, but it was yet to be published in this country because of a 5-year-long libel action in the Portuguese courts by the McCanns to try and have the book banned. It is actually still on sale and has been translated into 9 major European languages, all of them except English. In his book, Dr. Amaral mentions how members of the British security services, including staff from CEOP, helped to build a profile of the likely abductor. These men, whose names we don't know, soon put the name of Robert Murat into the frame. We could do a full programme on Robert Murat's involvement in this drama, and perhaps we will. He had joint Portuguese-British citizenship and was fluent in both languages. He had in fact been a police translator for Norfolk Police. He spent part of the year in England, part of it in Portugal, where he had a German girlfriend. For mysterious reasons, he suddenly booked a flight to Portugal at midnight on the 30th of April 2007 and was at Faro Airport in the early hours of the morning. Early on the 4th of May, as news was breaking worldwide of Madeleine's disappearance, Murat volunteered to translate all the interviews the Portuguese police were doing of the McCanns, their friends and other witnesses. During these interviews he acted so suspiciously and inappropriately, trying to sneak a look at confidential police documents on the case, for example, that a police inspector sent an urgent report on his behaviour to Dr. Amaral. Gossip about him was fed into the British mainstream media, and lurid headlines about him started to appear. His arrest was partly triggered by the work the CEOP staff were doing. Dr. Amaral in his book mentions that the staff from CEOP compiled a profile of the alleged abductor, compared that profile with Robert Murat, and convinced Dr. Amaral that Murat fitted their profile 90%. There is a big question mark about whether that was a genuine assessment, or whether it could have been part of a calculated ruse to get Robert Murat made a suspect, as indeed he was on the 15th of May. Authorisation for CEOP to become involved at all must have needed authorisation at the very highest level. Just who gave the order for the men from CEOP to be sent to Portugal? Before we leave the subject of Robert Murat altogether, here are a number of things for you to ponder about him. Murat was pulled in for questioning on the 15th of May by police. In interview, he was asked to give an account of his movements from his arrival in Portugal on the 1st of May to the 4th of May, when he volunteered to translate for the police. During this interview, Murat told the police 17 blatant lies about his movements during those 4 days. Here is a list of them. How was he caught out? Because several weeks later, the Portuguese police had analysed pings from his mobile phone to local mobile phone masts. These proved that he was not where he said he was during those 4 days. When these were put to him in a second interview on the 10th of July, he asked for a break in the interview. After the break, he came back and told an entirely different story. He told the police that on the 15th of May he had been too tired to tell the truth. One of those 17 lies was not to admit that he was in fact at the Palmeiras Golf Club near Lagos on the afternoon of the 3rd of May, about 7 hours before Madeleine was reported missing. Now, I've just pulled up at the Palmeiras Golf Club, which is a few miles east of Lagos, maybe 7 or 8 miles east of Praia de Luz. The significance of this increases when we consider two other points. First, the mobile phone records of both Robert Murat and Jerry McCann show a most remarkable coincidence. At about 3 p.m. on Wednesday the 2nd of May, both men suddenly switched off their mobile phones within 6 minutes of each other. Their mobiles then each remained switched off for a further 32 hours, until both men switched on their phones again at around 11 p.m. in the evening on the 3rd of May, an hour after Madeleine was reported missing. Again, they did so within 6 minutes of each other. That raises the question of whether the two men were already known to each other. Now, it is alleged that Jerry McCann met with Robert Murat at this golf club sometime before Madeleine went missing. So I'm just going to go in, take some footage of the outside and of the inside. Second, on this clip we see Jerry McCann, the day Robert Murat was made a suspect, asked a simple question. Do you already know Robert Murat?
But did you know Robert Murat?
I'm not going to comment on that.
He doesn't answer the question. He could easily have said no if the answer was no. What does his body language suggest? In addition, he looks evasive. The question clearly troubles him. He looks away from the interviewer and hurriedly terminates the interview. If we knew more about the nature of any relationship between Jerry McCann and Robert Murat, we would surely be able to understand a whole lot more about what really happened to Madeleine McCann. But let us now return to the subject of involvement of government and other political, media and establishment figures in actively assisting the McCanns. Let's look next at the involvement from the outset of Leicestershire Police. It is far from obvious why the police force in the parents' home county in England should get involved immediately in searching for their missing child in a foreign country, yet this is precisely what happened in this case. Superintendent Bob Small and at least 2 other officers from Leicestershire Constabulary were dispatched immediately to Praia de Luz. Bob Small was to play a highly crucial role in the decision by the Portuguese police to pull in Robert Murat for questioning. He was directly involved in the events leading up to the controversial event. It was on Sunday the 13th of May, 10 days after Madeleine's reported disappearance, that Jane Tanner was asked to take part in an identity parade to see if she could identify the person she had seen carrying a child on the evening of the 3rd of May. Significantly, before taking part in this exercise, she spoke to Superintendent Bob Small. Jane Tanner was asked by the police to sit in an unmarked police van with a two-way mirror. She could see out of the window perfectly, while those on the outside could not see what was within. It was arranged for a number of people to walk past the van, including Robert Murat, who now was at least a potential suspect. As Robert Murat walked past the unmarked police van, Jane Tanner became adamant to the police that he was the very man she'd seen walking near the McCann's apartment 10 days ago. Within 48 hours of Murat being made a suspect, 3 of the McCann's tapas 7 friends visited the Portuguese police, saying they were sure they had seen him hanging around the Ocean Club around 11 p.m. on the day Madeleine was reported missing. Thus 4 of the group were pointing the finger at Robert Murat. Why did they do this? Were they telling the truth? We can answer that in part by pointing out by the end of the year all 4 of them were once again singing from the same hymn sheet. But this time each one of them said that they had made a mistake and it wasn't Murat they'd seen. But these deep mysteries about Robert Murat will have to wait for another programme. So let's now look at another couple of people sent out on day 1 to help find Madeleine, or perhaps for some other purpose. They were Alan Pike and Martin Alderton, from a shadowy group called the Centre of Crisis Psychology, CCP as their name suggests. Their claimed speciality was to offer counselling to people in trauma following some kind of disaster. These 2 counsellors were apparently brought in and paid for by Mark Warner, the company who arranged the holiday for the McCanns and their friends. A Yorkshire newspaper, the Craven Herald, reported on Monday the 14th of May as follows. The 2 specialist trauma counsellors from Skipton have flown out to Portugal to help the devastated parents of missing 4-year-old Madeleine McCann. Consultants Alan Pike and Martin Alderton from the Centre of Crisis Psychology, based at Broughton Hall, have been by the side of Jerry and Kate McCann since their daughter Madeleine was abducted. The 2 experts were appointed by Mark Warner, the company which manages the resort, to assist Mr. and Mrs. McCann, both 38, on how to best deal with the stress and trauma of their terrible ordeal. Mr. Pike, who was leading the team, flew over to the resort with Mark Warner Managing Director David Hopkins the day after Madeleine disappeared. Once again, the sheer speed which these people rushed out to Praia da Luz has to be questioned. The first news that Madeleine was missing came out at breakfast time on Friday the 4th of May. Yet by the end of the day, the managing director of Mark Warner and 2 people from a crisis counselling group had booked a flight, booked accommodation in Portugal and boarded a plane to Faro. It turned out that CCP had a very close relationship with the government, having been used by the government in a number of major disasters across the country. A Mark Warner spokesman said that CCP came highly recommended by industry partners and have been known to us for some time. Their experience in dealing with a variety of incidents is second to none. The Craven Herald said that Alan Pike has been involved in consulting with companies following road traffic accidents, personal attacks, terrorist bombings, shootings, robberies, drowning and staff bereavement. It was an impressive list. Amongst others to have used CCP was entrepreneur Richard Branson. Before the month of May was out, even the Pope was roped in to support the McCanns. This was on Wednesday the 30th of May, less than 4 weeks after Madeleine had been reported missing. The Pope blessed a photograph of Madeleine. There was worldwide coverage of this event. Such a high-profile event had clearly been planned well in advance, and it had been achieved by the work of the government-appointed Media Relations Officer for the McCanns, Clarence Mitchell. He didn't actually fly out to Praia da Luz until the 22nd of May, 8 days before the McCanns' visit to the Pope. But we can be sure that he will have arranged this event well before then. Indeed, Mitchell openly boasted in a TV interview that it was he who had arranged the McCanns to visit the Pope, simply by asking the then Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Cormac Murphy O'Connor. Clearly, as the head of the government's media machine, Clarence Mitchell would have contacts with the most powerful people in the land, and without doubt, Cormac Murphy O'Connor was certainly one of those. The Pope's support for the McCanns extended to prominently publishing on the Vatican website the McCanns' appeal for people to look for Madeleine. However, the Vatican has one of the best intelligence networks in the world, and just 48 hours before the McCanns were pulled in for questioning, the Pope deleted the page from his website. No doubt a Portuguese Catholic had tipped off the Vatican that the McCanns were about to be made suspects. In her book, Kate McCann praised Alan Pike to the skies. The effect our conversation with Alan had on us was truly amazing. To say it helped would be a gross understatement. Alan was and remains a saviour. Another shadowy organisation was ready to help the McCanns from day one, the International Family Law Group. This is how Kate McCann describes how they became involved. We received help from a paralegal based in Leicestershire, via a colleague of Jerry's. He worked for a firm specialising in family law, the International Family Law Group, IFLG. So on the afternoon of Friday the 11th of May, the paralegal, accompanied by a barrister, flew out to Portugal. IFLG suggested making Madeleine a ward of the High Court, and they did so just a few days later, giving the High Court a range of powers in relation to Madeleine, assuming she was alive. It was this unnamed paralegal and unnamed barrister who then suggested, according to Kate, that they set up a fighting fund. Quite who they needed to fight at this stage was unclear. Kate says that IFLG would devise the objectives of the fund and instruct a leading charity law firm, Bates, Wells and Braithwaite, to draw up articles of association. These two unnamed figures then brought in a third unnamed figure into the picture. Again, let's hear about this in Kate's own words. At the last two meetings with IFLG, the barrister and legal assistant were joined by a consultant called Hugh, whose profession was not at first explained. "Just call me Hugh," he said enigmatically. It transpired that he was a former intelligence officer, now a kidnap negotiator and counsellor. We were told that an anonymous but evidently very generous donor had set aside a considerable sum of money for us to put towards hiring a private investigation company if we wished. Hugh had been brought in by a firm called Control Risks Group, which was primed to help. The company is an independent special risk company. Their main line is corporate security. The involvement of government and their agents is unprecedented in this case. But I'm going to go back and consider this alleged abductor. We have the evidence of Jerry and Kate McCann. Jerry says he saw Madeleine alive when he did his check on the children at around 9:05 to 9:10 p.m. that evening. Then, so it is claimed, Kate McCann discovered Madeleine missing from her bed when she did her check at around 10 p.m. She maintained many times that she knew instantly that Madeleine had been abducted. We know that the McCanns' friends, the so-called Tapas 7, generally back up the McCanns' story of an abductor. But apart from them, what actual independent or forensic evidence do we have of an abductor? Is there any forensic evidence? Footprints, fingerprints, hairs, clothing fibres, DNA, anything in fact? Absolutely none. The only fingerprint found on the window was actually that of Kate McCann, suggesting that she was the last person to handle the window, sometime shortly before the police were called. So did anyone hear this mystery abductor, maybe lifting shutters, entering or fleeing the building, the noise of a child, anything at all in fact? Again, absolutely nothing. Did anyone see someone who could have been an abductor? Yes is the answer to that one. 2 sightings of a man carrying a child were reported. One was by the McCanns' close friend, Jane Tanner, who says she saw a man carrying a child close to the McCanns' apartment at around 9:15 p.m. that evening. The other one was a claim by members of an Irish family that they saw a man carrying a child in a different part of the village at about 10 p.m. There are serious question marks over both of these alleged sightings. Firstly, it is possible that Jane Tanner fabricated her sighting in order to help her friends, the McCanns. There is also some doubt over the Smith sighting. This is because they did not report it until a full 12 days after Madeleine had been reported missing. This 12-day period might be significant when one considers that Martin Smith, who reported the sighting, was friends with Robert Murat. The sighting was reported shortly after Robert Murat was arrested, 12 days after the disappearance. We could add a lot more detail on these 2 sightings and why there are serious question marks over them. But we'll leave that for another show. There are many more aspects to this case that we haven't covered, but hopefully we've given you a broad understanding of the facts behind this case. Many of you will be wanting a clear answer as to what most likely happened to Madeleine McCann. Unfortunately, we can't give you this. In this final part of my films on the Madeleine McCann case, we've seen the heavy hand of government involvement right from day one. We've examined the involvement of the security services and of shadowy agencies like Control Risks Group and the Centre for Crisis Psychology with their obvious close contacts with the government. When we looked at Gary Hagland, we saw how he contacted one of his old friends in MI6. It's also become clear to me how far MI5 have been involved in this case, though this has never been adequately covered in the mainstream press. The original investigator in the case, Gonçalo Amaral, spoke in his book of the active involvement of MI5 in meetings in Portugal during the first few days of his investigation. We mentioned the vital evidence of police sniffer dog handler Martin Grime. He told Gonçalo Amaral that on his way back to England he was intercepted by a member of MI5 at Faro Airport. Most likely the MI5 officer wanted Grime to brief him about what he and his dogs had detected in Praia de Luz. We looked at the employment of Kevin Halligan and Oakley International. Halligan employed the services of two men, Henry Exton and Tim Craig Harvey. Exton obtained a Queen's Police Medal for his work in the Ministry of Defence, was awarded an OBE and, most significantly of all, was the head of covert intelligence for MI5. The McCann spokesman himself boasted in 2008 that all these men were top ex-MI5 men. So without a shadow of a doubt, MI5 was involved, heavily involved, in the government support operation on behalf of the McCanns. There's one obvious question. Why? Was it just because the McCanns or the McCanns' friends had connections with people in high places? Was it because the British government was perhaps concerned about the reputation of Britons abroad? Or could it have been something else? Let's just highlight one of the dubious activities of the intelligence agencies, highlighted by former London Mayor Ken Livingstone.
I was raising in Parliament up against Mrs Thatcher the Kincora Boys Home, where boys were being abused, and MI5 was filming it because they were hoping to be able to blackmail senior politicians in Northern Ireland.
We believe there are certain secrets concerning the activities of the intelligence agencies which cannot come out. They cannot be brought forward into a court. Is it the case that if the real truth were to come out in a trial, the state would have to fall?